The story of Ralph Waldo Emerson does not begin with a sudden flash of genius, but with the steady hum of a New England landscape that had been humming for centuries, a place where the echo of Puritan sermons still lingered in the wooden rafters of meeting houses, and where the scent of pine and the chill of Atlantic breezes mingled with the rustle of printed pamphlets in a small, earnest town. To understand Emerson's philosophy, we must first travel back to the modest farm in Boston's South End, where he was born on May 25, 1803, a place that, though modest in size, was perched on the edge of a cultural tide that would soon surge into something altogether new. His father, Reverend William Emerson, was a Unitarian minister, a man who had stepped away from the rigid Calvinist doctrines of his forebears and embraced a more rational, less punitive view of God. In the younger Emerson's mind, the pews of the church were not only a place of worship, but also a laboratory of ideas, a space where the old language of predestination was being quietly rewritten into a language of moral progress. The elder Emerson's sermons, while still steeped in the cadence of the Puritan tradition, began to speak of a God who was not a distant judge, but a living presence within the moral heart of the community. This subtle shift, this loosening of the theological noose, created a fertile ground for the young Ralph to question, to listen, and eventually to speak. When Ralph was 8, the family moved to Concord, a town that would later become synonymous with the Transcendentalist movement. Concord was, at that moment, a crucible of intellectual ferment. The town's meeting house, its schoolhouse, even its taverns were alive with debates about the nature of liberty, the role of the individual, and the meaning of the American experiment itself. In this environment, the old Puritan work ethic was being reframed by the burgeoning ideas of the Enlightenment and the Romanticism that was crossing the Atlantic. It was here that Emerson first encountered the writings of German philosophers, Fichte, Schelling, Kant, through the modest library of his uncle, a man who, despite his modest means, kept a collection of imported volumes that smelled faintly of ink and foreign dust. The German idealists, with their emphasis on the active role of the mind in shaping reality, offered Emerson a new lens through which to view the world. Fichte's notion that the self posits both itself and the not-self resonated with the young Emerson's growing sense that the individual could, through inner conviction, shape the outer world. Schelling's ideas about nature as a living, dynamic whole whispered to him that the universe was not a static machine but a breathing organism, a concept that would later surface in his essays on the Oversoul. These ideas were not merely academic for Emerson. They were, in his mind, a bridge between the stern, moralizing sermons of his childhood and a more expansive vision of humanity's place in the cosmos. It was during his teenage years that Emerson first tasted the power of public speaking, an experience that would become a cornerstone of his later influence. In 1821, at the age of 18, he delivered his first public address at the Boston Lyceum, a venue that had become a hub for intellectual exchange in the city. The Lyceum, with its high ceilings and rows of polished benches, was a place where the city's elite gathered to hear lectures on science, literature, and moral philosophy. As Emerson stepped onto that modest wooden platform, he felt the weight of the audience's expectation, a mixture of curiosity and the lingering suspicion that a young man from a Unitarian background might simply echo the familiar doctrines of his father. Yet when he began to speak, his voice carried a calm confidence, a measured cadence that seemed to draw the listeners inward, as if inviting them to look beyond the walls of the hall and into the vast interior of their own minds. He spoke of the power of the mind, a theme that would later become a hallmark of his work. He argued that the soul is a living fire, an eternal flame that can illuminate the darkest corners of human experience. The audience, accustomed to the more formal doctrinal sermons of the past, found themselves unsettled, yet intrigued. The applause that followed was not merely for the eloquence of his words, but for the subtle challenge they posed to the prevailing intellectual order. This early experience at the Lyceum was more than a personal triumph. It was a public declaration that the old theological frameworks were being questioned, that there was room for a new kind of discourse, one that emphasized intuition, inner experience, and the possibility of a direct, personal relationship with the divine. 2 years later, in 1823, Emerson entered Harvard College, an institution that, while steeped in classical education, was beginning to feel the tremors of the new intellectual currents that were sweeping the nation. At Harvard, he encountered the works of British Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, whose reverence for nature and the individual spirit resonated with his own developing sensibilities. He also met a young poet named Henry David Thoreau, a man of quiet disposition but fierce intellect, who would later become his close confidant and collaborator. Their friendship was not merely a meeting of minds. It was a partnership that would later produce some of the most enduring experiments in American thought. Thoreau's meticulous observations of the natural world, his insistence on living deliberately, and his willingness to stand alone against societal conventions would become a living embodiment of many of Emerson's philosophical propositions. After graduating, Emerson returned to Concord and took up the position of a schoolteacher at the Concord Academy. It was here, in the modest classroom with its chalk-dusted blackboard, that he began to refine his ideas about education and the development of the individual mind. He believed that true education was not about the rote transmission of facts, but about awakening the inner faculty of intuition. He once told his students, "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." This conviction would later surface in his famous essay, The American Scholar, where he called for a new kind of intellectual independence, one that would break free from the European literary canon and draw upon the unique spirit of the American continent. The 1830s in New England were a period of intense social experimentation. The old Puritan work ethic, though still present, was being challenged by a wave of utopian communities that sought to create societies based on shared ideals of equality, labor, and spiritual fulfillment. One of the most notable of these experiments was Brook Farm, founded in 1841 by George Ripley, a former Unitarian minister who, like Emerson, was disillusioned with the constraints of traditional theology. Brook Farm aimed to combine intellectual labor with agricultural work, creating a community where the mind and the body could develop in harmony. Emerson visited Brook Farm several times, and his observations there would later inform his reflections on the relationship between individual freedom and communal responsibility. At Brook Farm, Emerson witnessed a microcosm of the very tensions that animated his own thought. The community's members, many of them writers, teachers, and reformers, attempted to live out a philosophy that prized self-reliance while simultaneously embracing collective cooperation. The experiment, however, was fraught with practical difficulties: financial strain, disagreements over the role of labor, and the inevitable clash between idealistic aspirations and human frailties. Emerson's reflections on Brook Farm were nuanced. He praised the earnestness of its members, yet he also warned against the danger of a society that tries to force the soul into a mold. He saw in Brook Farm a living illustration of his own belief that true spirituality could not be institutionalized, that the oversoul was not something that could be legislated into existence, but must arise organically from the inner life of each individual. Another pivotal figure in this intellectual milieu was Margaret Fuller, a journalist, critic, and one of the first women to edit a major literary magazine in the United States, the New York Evening Post. Fuller's advocacy for women's rights, her insistence on the importance of individual self-expression, and her own explorations of transcendental thought made her an indispensable ally to Emerson. In 1840, she traveled to Europe, where she met the German philosophers and writers whose works had so profoundly influenced Emerson. Upon her return, she published Woman in the 19th Century, a groundbreaking work that argued for the intellectual and spiritual equality of women, a stance that resonated with Emerson's own convictions about the universality of the human spirit. Their correspondence, filled with lively debates on the nature of intuition and the role of the artist, exemplified the collaborative spirit that defined the Transcendentalist circle. The year 1832 marked a watershed moment in Emerson's public life, a moment that would reverberate through American intellectual history. On a crisp autumn evening, Emerson was invited to speak at the Boston Lyceum once again, this time on the subject of the oversoul. The hall was packed with a mixture of scholars, clergy, and curious citizens, all eager to hear the young lecturer who had already caused a stir with his earlier address. Emerson began by describing the oversoul as a universal spirit, an infinite and all-embracing presence that connects every individual to the divine. He spoke of an inner light that could be accessed through introspection, a light that transcended the dogmas of organized religion. His words were poetic, yet grounded in a rational appeal to the faculties of the mind. If we have no higher power, let it be the power of our own reason, the capacity to perceive truth within ourselves. The reaction was mixed. Some in the audience, especially those with a more conservative theological background, felt a sense of unease, as if a familiar foundation were being subtly undermined. Yet others, particularly the younger, more progressive members of the audience, felt an exhilarating sense of possibility. The evening ended with a standing ovation, but also with whispered conversations in the aisles, debates that would continue for weeks in the coffee houses and private parlors of Boston. This lecture not only cemented Emerson's reputation as a bold, original thinker, but also signaled a clear departure from the theological orthodoxy that had dominated New England for generations. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of Emerson's break with traditional theology came in 1841, when he delivered the Divinity School address at Harvard Divinity School. The invitation to speak there was both an honor and a test. The Divinity School was a bastion of orthodox Unitarian thought, and its faculty expected a discourse that would reinforce the established doctrines. Instead, Emerson presented a radical challenge. He opened with the declaration, "The Christian religion is a religion of the heart," and proceeded to argue that the divine was not confined to the pages of Scripture, nor to the pulpit of a church, but lived within each individual's conscience. He famously said, "The only way to have a God in our midst is to have God in ourselves." Emerson's address was a thunderclap that echoed across the academic landscape. The faculty, led by the eminent theologian Andrews Norton, responded with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Norton, in his subsequent pamphlet, denounced Emerson's ideas as the dangerous doctrine of self-worship, warning that such a philosophy would erode the moral fabric of society. Yet among the students, a different response blossomed. Many felt liberated, as if a door to personal spiritual exploration had been opened. The address sparked a wave of pamphlets, newspaper articles, and private letters debating the nature of faith, the authority of Scripture, and the role of individual intuition. It was, in many ways, the public culmination of the intellectual journey that began in Emerson's childhood home, a journey from the measured sermons of his father to a bold proclamation that the divine spark resides within every human heart. The controversy surrounding the Divinity School address also attracted criticism from literary contemporaries who were not strictly theological. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a close friend of Emerson and a writer deeply attuned to the moral complexities of the human soul, penned an essay titled "The American Scholar," in which he offered a measured critique. Hawthorne praised Emerson's emphasis on self-reliance, yet he warned, "The danger lies not in the elevation of the self, but in the neglect of the shadow that the self casts." He argued that Emerson's optimism about human nature risked overlooking the darker impulses that reside within every individual, the same darkness that Hawthorne explored in his own fiction. Hawthorne's critique, while respectful, served as a reminder that the path Emerson was forging was not without its pitfalls, that the pursuit of spiritual autonomy required a vigilant awareness of the human propensity for hubris. In response to such criticisms, Emerson often turned to his own writings to clarify his position. In his essay, Self-Reliance, he wrote, "A man should learn to obey his own mind. For it is only by trusting the inner voice that one may truly become a free individual." Yet he also acknowledged in the same work that the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps his own self and does not succumb to the tyranny of the majority. This tension between confidence in the individual spirit and humility before the unknown became a defining feature of his philosophical stance. It reflected the broader cultural struggle of a young nation trying to define its identity apart from European antecedents, while still grappling with the lingering shadows of its Puritan past. The influence of German idealism continued to permeate Emerson's thought throughout this period. He often quoted Fichte's assertion that the self posits the not-self, using it as a metaphor for how the individual must confront the external world in order to define itself. He also drew upon Schelling's concept of nature as a visible spirit, which he expressed poetically in his essay, Nature, where he wrote, "The stars awaken a certain reverence because though far away, they are still a part of the same living whole." These philosophical borrowings were not mere academic exercises. They provided Emerson with a vocabulary to articulate an American spirituality that was both universal and particular, rooted in the New England experience, yet reaching toward a global, metaphysical horizon. Another anecdote that illustrates Emerson's evolving stance comes from his 1837 visit to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where he examined early colonial documents and the writings of the Puritan founders. While perusing the diaries of John Winthrop, Emerson was struck by the phrase, "a city upon a hill." He reflected that the Puritans had envisioned America as a moral beacon, but he sensed that this vision had become a rigid external expectation rather than an internal, lived reality. He later wrote, "The true city upon a hill is not built of stone, but of the inner convictions that rise from each soul." This insight, drawn from a historical source, reinforced his belief that spiritual renewal must begin within, not be imposed from without. Emerson's break from traditional theology was also shaped by the social reforms sweeping through the nation. The abolitionist movement, gaining momentum in the 1830s, challenged the moral complacency of many religious institutions that had, either through silence or complicity, upheld the institution of slavery. Emerson, after hearing the impassioned speeches of William Lloyd Garrison, began to see the moral imperative of aligning one's inner convictions with outward action. In his 1838 essay, The American Scholar, he urged readers to speak the truth to power, emphasizing that intellectual independence must be coupled with moral responsibility. This stance placed him at odds with many conservative clergy who preferred to keep the social order intact, further deepening the rift between Emerson's emerging philosophy and the established religious establishment. The intellectual ferment of the 1830s also saw the rise of the American Romantic literary movement, with figures such as Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper exploring themes of individualism and the sublime in nature. Emerson's own poetry, though less celebrated than his prose, reflected this cultural shift. In his poem Brahma, he invoked the Hindu concept of the ultimate reality, demonstrating his willingness to draw from non-Western sources, a bold move that signaled his departure from the Eurocentric theological framework that had dominated New England for so long. By integrating Eastern philosophical ideas, Emerson positioned himself within a broader, more inclusive spiritual dialogue, one that recognized the universal quest for meaning across cultures. The interaction between Emerson and his contemporaries was not limited to intellectual exchange. It also manifested in personal encounters that shaped his worldview. One such moment occurred in the summer of 1842, when Emerson and Thoreau took a walk along the banks of the Concord River. As they paused to watch a heron standing still in the water, Emerson remarked, "Observe how the bird trusts the river's flow. It does not fight the current but moves with it, guided by an inner sense of direction." Thoreau, ever the keen observer, responded, "And yet the bird must also be aware of the hidden stones beneath the surface." This simple exchange captured the essence of their shared philosophy, an embrace of intuition tempered by an awareness of the unseen challenges that lie beneath the surface of experience. The Brook Farm experiment also provided a tangible setting for Emerson to test his ideas about community and individuality. In 1844, after the failure of the community's initial economic model, Emerson visited the farm and observed the members wrestling with the tension between personal freedom and collective responsibility. He noted the attempt to merge the soul's yearning for self-expression with the demands of communal living is a noble experiment, yet it often reveals the paradox that the more we strive to bind ourselves to a common purpose, the more we risk stifling the very spirit we seek to nurture. This observation would later inform his writings on the balance between self-reliance and social engagement, a balance that he believed was essential for a healthy democratic society. Amid these debates, Emerson's own writings continued to evolve. In 1841, the same year as his Divinity School address, he published Essays. First series, a collection that included Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, and Nature. Each essay, while distinct, formed a cohesive tapestry that wove together his reflections on the individual mind, the interconnectedness of all life, and the possibility of direct spiritual experience without mediation. In Nature, he famously wrote, "To go into solitude, to be alone, is a necessary condition of the soul's growth." This line, echoing the Romantic emphasis on solitude, also reflected the Puritan tradition of solitary prayer, a tradition that Emerson reinterpreted as an inward turn toward personal revelation rather than an external, ritualistic practice. The reception of Emerson's ideas was not uniformly hostile. Some contemporaries, such as Margaret Fuller, embraced his vision wholeheartedly. In a review of Essays, First series, Fuller praised Emerson for opening a new horizon in American thought, one that invites the mind to wander beyond the familiar shores of doctrine and to explore the infinite seas of intuition. She saw in Emerson's work a promise of cultural maturity, a step toward an American identity that could stand on its own intellectual feet. This endorsement helped to solidify Emerson's position within the Transcendentalist circle and gave momentum to the broader movement that sought to define a uniquely American philosophical voice. Nevertheless, the critics' concerns were not easily dismissed. Hawthorne's essay, while acknowledging Emerson's contributions, warned that the elevation of the self must be accompanied by a humility that recognizes the limits of human understanding. He feared that Emerson's optimism could lead to a form of spiritual narcissism, a belief that the individual's intuition alone could substitute for the communal wisdom of tradition. Hawthorne's cautionary tone resonates today, reminding us that any philosophical system that places the self at the center must also grapple with the ethical implications of such centrality. In examining the broader context of Emerson's break from traditional theology, it is essential to consider the influence of the American Revolution and the ensuing political discourse on liberty and self-governance. The Revolution had introduced a new language of rights, of the individual as a bearer of inalienable freedoms. This political rhetoric seeped into religious thought, encouraging thinkers like Emerson to imagine a spiritual realm where the individual's inner voice could claim a similar kind of sovereignty. The notion that all men are created equal was not only a political slogan, but also a theological proposition for Emerson. If all individuals are equal before the law, perhaps they are also equal before the divine, each possessing an equal capacity to access the oversoul. The 1830s also witnessed the rise of the Second Great Awakening, a revivalist movement that emphasized emotional religious experience over doctrinal orthodoxy. While the revivalists were often more evangelical than Emerson, the shared emphasis on personal, emotional encounters with the divine created a cultural environment that was more receptive to his ideas. Yet Emerson distinguished his approach by rejecting the external trappings of revivalist fervor: no camp meetings, no ecstatic preaching, preferring instead the quiet, contemplative solitude that he believed allowed the inner voice to be heard most clearly. In this way, Emerson's philosophy can be seen as both a product of, and a reaction to, the religious currents of his time. The cross-reference to German idealism also offers a deeper understanding of why Emerson's break from traditional theology was so radical. Fichte's concept of the I as an active, self-positing subject provided Emerson with a philosophical foundation for his doctrine of self-reliance. Schelling's notion of nature as a visible spirit resonated with Emerson's reverence for the natural world as a conduit for divine insight. Moreover, Kant's critical philosophy, with its emphasis on the limits of pure reason and the role of the noumenal, gave Emerson a framework to argue that the divine could not be fully captured by rational discourse alone, but must be approached through intuition and feeling. By integrating these European ideas into an American context, Emerson created a hybrid philosophy that was simultaneously local and universal. One cannot overlook the role of the printing press in disseminating Emerson's ideas. The 1830s and 1840s saw a proliferation of periodicals: the Boston Lyceum, the Boston Courier, the New York Evening Post, through which essays, speeches, and critiques circulated rapidly. Emerson's essays were often first published in these journals before being collected into books. This mode of distribution allowed his thoughts to reach a broader audience, including those who might never attend a lecture at the Lyceum or a sermon at a church. The immediacy of the printed word amplified the impact of his ideas, turning philosophical discourse into a public conversation that could be debated in coffee houses, parlors, and even on the newly emerging railroad cars that connected distant towns. The public debate surrounding Emerson's philosophy also had a tangible effect on the educational institutions of the time. After the Divinity School address, Harvard's faculty began to reconsider the curriculum, gradually incorporating more literature, philosophy, and natural science into their courses, moving away from a strict theological focus. This shift mirrored Emerson's belief that education should cultivate the whole person, mind, heart, and spirit, rather than merely preparing clergy for the pulpit. In this sense, Emerson's influence extended beyond the realm of philosophy into the very structure of American higher education. The legacy of Emerson's break from traditional theology can be observed in the way later American thinkers approached spirituality. Later figures such as Walt Whitman, whose poetic celebration of the self and the body echoed Emerson's reverence for individual experience, and later Transcendentalists like Bronson Alcott, who pursued educational reforms based on the belief that each child possessed an inner light, all drew upon the foundations that Emerson helped lay. Even the modern New Thought movement, with its emphasis on the power of positive thinking and the mind's ability to shape reality, can trace intellectual lineage back to Emerson's conviction that the soul is a living fire. Yet, as we reflect on these historical currents, we must also ask, what does Emerson's journey from New England Calvinism to the birth of Transcendentalism teach us about the nature of intellectual transformation? Is it merely a story of one man's rebellion against doctrinal constraints, or does it reveal a deeper pattern in which cultural, social, and philosophical forces intertwine to create new ways of seeing the world? The answer perhaps lies in the very anecdotes we have recounted. The Lyceum Lecture of 1832, the Divinity School Address of 1841, the conversations at Brook Farm, the dialogues with Thoreau and Fuller, all these moments illustrate a dynamic interplay between personal conviction and communal discourse. Emerson's ideas did not emerge in isolation. They were forged in the crucible of a society in flux, a society grappling with its own identity, its own sins, and its own aspirations. When we hear Emerson's words, "The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be," we hear not only a call to personal agency, but also an invitation to engage with the broader world, to recognize that each individual's inner fire contributes to the collective illumination of humanity. This dual emphasis on the inner and the outer, the personal and the communal, remains one of the most compelling aspects of his philosophy. It reminds us that the break from traditional theology was not a rejection of the past, but a transformation, a reimagining of the relationship between the self, the community, and the divine. In tracing Emerson's early environment, we see how his Unitarian upbringing provided a theological foundation that was already more liberal than the rigid Calvinism of his ancestors. The lingering Puritan ethic of hard work and moral seriousness, however, remained embedded in the cultural soil of New England. The intellectual ferment of the 1830s, spurred by German idealism, the Romantic movement, social experiments like Brook Farm, and the rising tide of abolitionism, supplied the nutrients that allowed Emerson's ideas to sprout. The key figures of his circle, Thoreau, Fuller, Hawthorne, and the members of the Brook Farm community, served as both collaborators and challengers, sharpening his thoughts through debate and shared experience. The two vivid anecdotes we have explored, the 1832 Lyceum Lecture, where young Emerson first tested the waters of public intellectualism, and the 1841 Divinity School Address, where he boldly declared the presence of the divine within each individual, serve as pivotal moments that illustrate the evolution of his thought. The counterarguments offered by Hawthorne's essay and Nathaniel Hawthorne's critique, along with the theological backlash from Andrews Norton, demonstrate that Emerson's ideas were not universally embraced, but rather contested, debated, and refined through opposition. Cross-referencing the German idealist tradition, we see how Fichte's emphasis on the self-positing I, Schelling's vision of nature as a living spirit, and Kant's critical limits of reason all provided intellectual scaffolding for Emerson's own transcendental assertions. These European influences, filtered through the lens of American experience, enabled Emerson to articulate a philosophy that was simultaneously rooted in the New England tradition and reaching toward a universal, cosmopolitan understanding of the human spirit. In the end, Emerson's break from traditional theology was not a simple rupture, but a complex weaving together of inherited religious sensibilities, contemporary social movements, philosophical imports, and personal introspection. It was a process that unfolded in the lecture halls of Boston, the classrooms of Concord, the communal fields of Brook Farm, and the quiet riverside walks of Concord's countryside. It was a journey that invited the nation to consider that the city upon a hill might be built not from stone, but from the inner convictions of each individual, lit by the oversoul that connects us all. As we listen to Emerson's voice across the centuries, we are reminded that the quest for spiritual autonomy, for an authentic connection to the divine within, remains as urgent today as it was in the restless, hopeful days of early 19th century New England. When we turn our attention to Ralph Waldo Emerson, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of a uniquely American philosophical tradition, one that reaches back to the romantic reveries of Wordsworth and Shelley and stretches forward into the environmental ethic of Aldo Leopold and the entrepreneurial optimism of Silicon Valley. Emerson's thought is not a dry system of propositions, but a living conversation with the world, a conversation that begins, in his own words, with the first breath of the morning and ends with the last sigh of the night. In this segment, we will explore three of his signature ideas, self-reliance, the oversoul, and nature, by examining the original texts, the historical moments that shaped them, the ways they echo across cultures, and the criticisms that have kept them from becoming unassailable dogma. As we move through each concept, imagine yourself walking beside Emerson on the banks of the Concord River, feeling the wind that once stirred his pen, and hearing the quiet voice of the oversoul humming beneath the rustle of leaves. Self-reliance is perhaps the most immediately recognizable of Emerson's ideas, and it begins with a simple, almost paradoxical command: trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string. The opening paragraph of his 1841 essay reads like a manifesto for the individual, yet it is also a meditation on the nature of authenticity. Emerson writes, "A man must be a nonconformist, must be a rebel against the habit, the tradition, the law, the custom, the precept, the habit of thought." He does not merely urge us to think differently. He insists that the very act of thinking must spring from an inner wellspring that is unmediated by external authority. In the language of the essay, the iron string is the innate moral compass that each person carries, a compass that can be dulled by the imitation of other men and the habit of conformity. To see self-reliance in action, we need only look to the American frontier of the early 19th century. The pioneers who pressed westward across the Great Plains embodied, whether they realized it or not, the very principle Emerson described. They were individuals who could not rely on the established institutions of the East, no banks, no courts, no steady markets, to guarantee their survival. Their lives were a daily practice of trusting their own judgment, of reading the land, the weather, the behavior of the buffalo, and deciding when to plant, when to move, when to risk a new trade. The frontier myth, later romanticized by Frederick Jackson Turner, can be read as an extended illustration of Emerson's claim that the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps to himself. The frontier was a crowd of solitary individuals, each carving a path through an unknown wilderness, guided by a confidence that could only be described as self-reliant. Fast forward 2 centuries, and the same principle resurfaces in a very different setting: the modern entrepreneurial culture. Think of the garage-born startups that have become the new gold rush. The founders of companies like Apple, Google, or more recently, a small AI-focused firm in a co-working space, often cite a belief in their own vision as the catalyst that allowed them to defy established market expectations. When Steve Jobs declared, "Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work," he was echoing Emerson's insistence that authenticity, not conformity, is the path to greatness. The venture capital pitch deck, with its bold statements about disrupting an industry, is a contemporary ritual of self-reliance, a public affirmation that the entrepreneur's inner conviction outweighs the inertia of existing structures. But Emerson's essay is not merely a cheerleading chant for individualism. It is a careful, almost surgical, analysis of the obstacles that prevent us from trusting ourselves. He identifies consistency as a false idol, writing, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." Here, Emerson anticipates a critique that would later be taken up by the pragmatist William James. James, in his 1907 essay, The Will to Believe, argued that Emerson's brand of self-reliance could slide into an over-idealism that neglects the practical consequences of belief. James warned that the uncritical glorification of the self can become a dangerous neglect of the social and empirical constraints that shape human life. In other words, while Emerson celebrates the inner voice, James reminds us that that voice does not exist in a vacuum. It is always already entangled with community, with history, with the material world. The tension between Emerson's idealism and James's pragmatism is not merely academic, it plays out in the real world. Consider the modern phenomenon of self-help literature that promises to unlock personal potential through sheer willpower. Critics have pointed out that such narratives often ignore structural inequalities, race, class, gender, that limit the options available to many individuals. The promise of self-reliance, when stripped of its social context, can become a subtle form of victim blaming. Yet Emerson himself was aware of this paradox. He wrote, "Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the better securing of his property, to surrender the liberty and culture of the mind to the majority." His critique of society is not an endorsement of isolation, but a call for a balance. An inner freedom that can coexist with a responsible engagement with the world. If we pause here, we might ask, does Emerson's call to trust oneself inevitably lead to solipsism? The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre would say yes, if we ignore the relational dimension of consciousness. In his 1943 lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre warned that the self can become a prison if it refuses to recognize the other as a free subject. He argued that the authentic self must acknowledge the freedom of others, lest it become a tyrant of its own imagination. This existentialist counterposition serves as a reminder that the self, however vital, is always already in dialogue with the other. Emerson, for his part, does not deny this dialogue. In the same essay he writes, "The only reward for a man who has been honest is the knowledge that he has done his duty." The duty, for Emerson, is not just to oneself, but to the larger moral order that he perceives as an expression of the Oversoul, a concept we now turn to. The Oversoul is perhaps Emerson's most ambitious metaphysical claim, presented in the 1841 lecture, The Oversoul. In it, he proposes a universal, all-encompassing spirit that unites every individual mind, a divine presence that is both immanent and transcendent. He begins, "We live in a perpetual eclipse of the light, and the only way we can be free is to turn our faces toward the sun." The Oversoul, for Emerson, is the source of intuition, the wellspring of moral insight, the ultimate reality that lies beyond the fleeting appearances of the material world. He writes, "The Oversoul is the eternal, the infinite, the all-powerful, the supreme, the universal, the indivisible, the absolute." In this language, Emerson reaches across the Atlantic to the Romantic poets, echoing the spirit of the universe that Wordsworth described in his lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, where the poet feels the still, sad music of humanity as a shared, timeless chorus. Yet Emerson's Oversoul is not a mere borrowing of European Romanticism. It is a synthesis that engages directly with Eastern philosophies, particularly Advaita Vedanta and Taoism. In a letter to his friend Henry David Thoreau, Emerson confessed that he was deeply interested in the Vedanta doctrine of the identity of the individual soul with the universal. Advaita Vedanta posits that the individual self, Atman, is not separate from the ultimate reality, Brahman, a view that resonates with Emerson's claim that the soul of man is the soul of the world. Likewise, the Taoist principle of wu-wei, or effortless action, finds a counterpart in Emerson's assertion that the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps to himself, suggesting that true action arises not from forced will, but from alignment with the larger flow of the Oversoul. Historical anecdotes illuminate how Emerson's ideas about the Oversoul moved from the lecture hall into the social fabric of his time. In 1844, at a meeting of the Transcendental Club in Boston, Emerson delivered a reading of the Oversoul that sparked a fervent discussion among the group's members, including Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, and Theodore Parker. Fuller, who would later become a pioneering feminist journalist, recalled in her diary that the lecture filled the room with a sense that we are not alone, that each of our thoughts is a ripple in a boundless ocean. The meeting was not merely an intellectual gathering. It was a communal experience of the Oversoul, a shared recognition that the individual voices in the room were part of a larger, divine conversation. 4 years later, Emerson embarked on a European tour that would bring his Oversoul to an even broader audience. In 1851, he visited England, Scotland, and France, meeting with the likes of Thomas Carlyle and the poet William Wordsworth. During a dinner in the Lake District, Emerson recounted his experience of standing on the shores of Ullswater, feeling the universal breath that connected him to the English landscape. Wordsworth, who had spent his life articulating the spiritual communion between humanity and nature, responded, "Your thoughts echo the ancient song of the hills." This encounter underscores how Emerson's Oversoul was not an isolated American invention, but a bridge between the romantic sensibility of Europe and the emerging transcendental spirit of the New World. The Oversoul, however, is not without its critics. William James, while appreciating Emerson's poetic vision, argued that the concept could become a slippery slope toward mysticism that evades empirical verification. In his 1905 work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James noted that the claim of a universal consciousness is, in practice, an assertion that cannot be tested by the ordinary methods of science, and thus remains a matter of personal feeling rather than public knowledge. James's pragmatic approach suggests that the Oversoul, while inspiring, may lack the methodological rigor required for philosophical certainty. Sartre, on the other hand, would criticize the Oversoul for erasing the radical freedom of the individual. He wrote, "If the self is merely a manifestation of a universal spirit, then the responsibility for choice is diluted, and the authenticity of the individual is compromised." For Sartre, the only authentic existence is one that acknowledges its own contingency and the absence of any pre-established cosmic order. Nevertheless, the Oversoul continues to reverberate in contemporary thought. In environmental philosophy, the idea that all living things share a common spiritual essence underpins Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which declares that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. Leopold's ethic can be seen as a secular, ecological reinterpretation of Emerson's Oversoul, the moral imperative to act in harmony with a larger, interdependent whole. In modern mindfulness practices, the notion that individual consciousness is part of a broader field of awareness echoes Emerson's insistence that the soul of man is the soul of the world, even in the realm of quantum physics, where the concept of entanglement suggests that particles remain connected across vast distances. Some philosophers draw a loose parallel to the Oversoul's claim of universal interconnection, though they caution against conflating poetic metaphor with scientific theory. Turning now to the third pillar of Emerson's thought, nature, we encounter perhaps the most accessible yet profoundly layered aspect of his philosophy. In his 1836 essay, Nature, Emerson opens with a declaration that the stars in the heavens, the moon in the sky, the sun in the day, the earth, the air, the water, the fire, the animals, the plants, all of these are the elements of a single great work. For Emerson, nature is not a backdrop for human activity. It is an active participant in the formation of the mind. He writes, "In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through the man's heart, a feeling that he is a part of the whole, a part of the great, the divine." This sentiment places nature as both metaphor and epistemology, a means by which we come to know ourselves and the universe. The poem The Rhodora, written in 1834, serves as a poetic illustration of this epistemic function. In it, Emerson describes a solitary flower blooming in the woods, unnoticed by humans, yet radiant in its own right. Then I never thought to ask the rose / the reason why the rhodora / why she should bloom in the shade / what she has done, or why she is there. The poem suggests that nature's value does not depend on human recognition. Rather, it possesses an intrinsic worth that can inspire contemplation. The shade becomes a metaphor for the unknown, a space where human presumption is humbled and where the mind learns to listen to the quiet voice of the natural world. The American Romantic tradition, with its reverence for the sublime, provides a fertile backdrop for Emerson's nature philosophy. William Wordsworth's Lines Written in Early Spring captures a similar awe. I hear the gentle rustling of the leaves, and feel the pulse of the earth beneath my feet. Shelley's Ode to the West Wind also celebrates the transformative power of natural forces. Emerson, however, moves beyond admiration to claim that nature is a conduit for moral insight. He famously writes, "The lover of nature is a lover of his own self." In this sense, nature is a mirror, reflecting back the inner workings of the soul, and also a teacher, offering lessons about impermanence, interdependence, and resilience. Historical anecdotes again help us see how Emerson's ideas about nature were lived out in his time. In 1845, Emerson purchased a small plot of land near Concord, now known as the Emerson House, where he cultivated a garden of native plants, including the very rhodora that inspired his poem. He invited friends to sit under the trees and discuss philosophy, turning his garden into a living laboratory of transcendental thought. Thoreau, who later retreated to Walden Pond, recorded in his journal that the Garden of Emerson is a place where the soul meets the earth and the mind is refreshed by the whisper of the wind. This anecdote illustrates how Emerson's theoretical musings about nature were inseparable from his daily practice. A second anecdote involves Emerson's participation in the 1860 National Academy of Sciences meeting in Washington, D.C., where he delivered a speech titled Nature and the Spirit. In his address, he argued that scientific inquiry should be guided by an ethical reverence for the natural world, a stance that prefigured the modern environmental movement. He warned, "When we cut down the forest, we cut down ourselves, for the forest is the living memory of the earth." Though his speech was met with polite applause, some of the more materialist scientists of the time dismissed his ideas as sentimental, reflecting an early tension between the scientific rationalism of the age and the spiritual ecology of Emerson's thought. Critics of Emerson's nature philosophy have emerged from both pragmatist and existentialist camps. William James, again, questioned whether Emerson's romanticized view of nature could be reconciled with the practical demands of industrializing America. In a series of lectures on pragmatism, James argued that the moral worth of nature should be judged by its capacity to serve human needs, not by an abstract reverence. He feared that an over-idealized view of nature might impede progress and technological development. Sartre, on the other hand, would see Emerson's reverence for nature as a potential escape from the angst of human freedom. He wrote, "To find solace in the indifferent trees is to deny the responsibility that comes with consciousness." For Sartre, the universe does not provide moral guidance. The individual must create meaning amidst the indifferent natural world. Yet, in contemporary environmental ethics, Emerson's ideas have found renewed relevance. Aldo Leopold's land ethic, as mentioned earlier, directly invokes the notion that humans are members of a larger ecological community. Leopold's famous dictum, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community," mirrors Emerson's claim that the sun shines to make us rejoice, not to be a source of power for industry. Modern deep ecology thinkers, such as Arne Nies, echo Emerson's call for a self-realization that expands beyond the individual to encompass the whole of nature. They argue that the sense of self-reliance should be transformed into a self-reliance that recognizes the interdependence of all life forms. To bring these threads together, let us consider a concrete example that we can observe today. The movement to restore native prairie ecosystems in the Midwest. Conservationists, guided by the principle that the land has its own intrinsic value, plant native grasses, wildflowers, and the occasional rhodora, allowing the ecosystem to re-establish its own rhythms. The project is not driven solely by economic benefit, but by a belief that the land, as an expression of the oversoul, deserves to thrive. This reflects Emerson's conviction that the greatest delight which the fields and woods can afford is the sense of belonging to a larger, living whole. Another modern illustration lies in the practice of forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku, popularized in Japan and now spreading worldwide. Participants immerse themselves in a forest environment, breathing deeply, listening to the rustle of leaves, and allowing the natural world to calm the mind. The experience often leads to a feeling of connectedness that resonates with Emerson's claim that the eyes are the windows of the soul, and the soul sees the world through them. Scientific studies have shown that forest bathing reduces cortisol levels, improves immune function, and fosters a sense of well-being, empirical evidence that supports Emerson's intuition that nature is a source of moral and physiological nourishment. When we juxtapose the three core concepts, self-reliance, the oversoul, and nature, we see a coherent philosophical architecture. Self-reliance provides the individual with the courage to trust inner conviction. The oversoul offers a metaphysical framework that situates that individual within a universal consciousness, and nature supplies the experiential ground upon which both the inner and the universal are discovered. Each concept reinforces the others, forming a feedback loop. The self trusts its inner voice, which is heard more clearly when one is attuned to the natural world. The natural world, in turn, becomes a living illustration of the oversoul's unity. The awareness of that unity strengthens the resolve to act independently, yet responsibly. Yet, the cross-references to other thinkers remind us that Emerson's ideas are part of an ongoing dialogue. Wordsworth's intimations of immortality echo Emerson's belief that the soul is forever linked to a larger cosmic rhythm. Shelley's The Cloud personifies nature as a dynamic, ever-changing entity, much like Emerson's view of the natural world as a living text. Aldo Leopold's land ethic translates Emerson's poetic reverence into a concrete environmental principle. And the critiques of William James and Jean-Paul Sartre serve as necessary checks, urging us to temper idealism with pragmatism and to guard against the temptation to retreat into solipsism. In the final analysis, Emerson's philosophy invites us to cultivate a balanced stance, to be self-reliant, not in isolation, but in harmony with the oversoul and the natural world, to recognize a universal spirit without dissolving the responsibility of individual choice, to honor nature as both a source of knowledge and a moral partner. As Emerson himself concluded in Self-Reliance, to be great is to be misunderstood. Perhaps the true measure of greatness lies not in how many misunderstand us, but in how faithfully we listen to the inner voice that the oversoul whispers through the rustling leaves, the distant mountains, and the quiet moments when we stand alone on the frontier of our own thoughts. So as you pause after this segment, consider the following. Are you living in a way that trusts your own heart, even when society urges conformity? Do you sense a larger, unifying presence that connects you to every other mind, to the trees, to the river that runs through your town? And finally, when you step outside, whether onto a city park bench or into a wilderness trail, do you feel that nature is not merely scenery, but a teacher, a mirror, and a moral compass? Emerson would say yes, and he would urge you to keep walking, keep listening, and keep trusting, because the journey toward self-reliance, the journey toward the oversoul, and the journey into nature are, ultimately, one and the same path. What does it mean to be a single, thinking soul in a world that demands we look beyond ourselves? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the towering voice of mid-19th century American Transcendentalism, seemed to have found a way to hold that tension in his very breath. In his essays, The American Scholar and Politics, he sketches a vision of the individual that is at once fiercely autonomous and deeply responsible to the larger community. To hear Emerson speak is to hear a man who trusts the inner light of each person, yet who also feels that light must be allowed to shine upon and for others. How can a philosophy of radical self-reliance coexist with a call for social responsibility? Let us wander through his words, his deeds, and the challenges raised by his contemporaries and later thinkers to see how Emerson attempts to reconcile those seemingly opposite demands. In The American Scholar, delivered to the Phi Beta Kappa Society in Cambridge in 1837, Emerson frames the scholar as a man thinking. He writes, "The scholar must be a man of his own. A man who is not a mere echo of the past, but a living, breathing voice of his own time." The emphasis is unmistakable. The scholar must trust his own mind, his own perception, his own intuition. Yet Emerson does not celebrate isolation. He follows the call for self-trust with a reminder that the mind is a conduit, a channel for the currents of the universe. He asks his listeners to receive the thoughts of the world and then to return them, transformed, to the world. In this way, the individual is not a hermit on a mountaintop, but a participant in a larger, ever-flowing conversation. The same paradox appears in his later essay Politics, published in 1844. Here Emerson confronts the pressing issues of his day, democracy, slavery, education, through the lens of his transcendental optimism. He declares the political world is a garden that must be tended, not with the iron of tyranny, but with the gentle hand of liberty. He does not deny the importance of institutions. Rather, he insists that those institutions must be rooted in the moral integrity of the individual. For Emerson, democracy is not a mere mechanism of majority rule, it is an expression of the inner moral compass of each citizen. He writes, if each man is a true self-reliant soul, then the polity becomes a chorus of authentic voices, each singing its own part, yet harmonizing into a greater song. The metaphor of a chorus, of many distinct notes forming a harmonious whole, recurs throughout his work and offers a vivid image of how individualism can serve the community. Emerson's stance on abolitionism illustrates this synthesis in practice. In 1844, he took to the podium in Boston's Tremont Temple to deliver a powerful anti-slavery speech. He began, "The slave holder in his heart is a man who has turned his back on his own humanity, and in doing so has denied humanity to another." He appealed not merely to political expediency, but to the moral imperative that springs from self-knowledge. He argued that a nation that prides itself on liberty could not in good conscience tolerate the institution of slavery, because the very act of enslaving another is a betrayal of the self-trust that each soul must cultivate. In that moment, Emerson's individualist ethic became a call to collective action. He urged his audience to let their inner convictions spill into the public sphere, to let the inner voice become a public voice that condemns injustice. His speech resonated with the growing abolitionist movement, and it cemented his reputation as a moral leader who would not let his philosophical ideals remain abstract. The correspondence between Emerson and Henry David Thoreau during the Civil War provides another concrete illustration of how Emerson's philosophy was lived out. In a letter dated March 1862, Emerson wrote to Thoreau, "Your steadfastness in the face of this great national wound reminds me that the soul's resolve must not be softened by the tumult of the times." He praised Thoreau's refusal to pay the poll tax, a protest against the war and slavery, calling it a testament to the power of the individual conscience when it refuses to be drowned by the tide of majority opinion. Thoreau's act of civil disobedience was, for Emerson, a living proof that personal integrity can shape public conscience. In a later reply, Emerson urged Thoreau to continue his quiet resistance, noting that the nation's healing will depend upon each man's willingness to stand, even alone, for what his heart knows to be true. Their exchange underscores a core Emersonian claim, that the health of the community is inseparable from the moral health of each individual. Yet Emerson's vision was not without its critics. In the same era that he championed self-trust, a vibrant current of communalist thought was taking shape. The Fourierists, followers of Charles Fourier, imagined a society organized into phalansteries, self-sufficient communities where labor was divided according to natural passions, and where the individual's desires were harmonized within a larger social fabric. Fourier famously declared, "The individual will never be truly free until he is placed in a community that allows his passions to find their proper outlet." To the Fourierists, Emerson's emphasis on the solitary thinker risked neglecting the social conditions that shape and sometimes constrain personal freedom. They argued that true self-realization could not be achieved in isolation, but only through participation in a cooperative whole that meets material needs and nurtures collective well-being. Similarly, the Owenites, inspired by Robert Owen's experiments at New Harmony and later at New Lanark, emphasized the importance of structured, cooperative communities as a remedy to the ills of industrial capitalism. Owen wrote, "The happiness of the individual is inseparable from the happiness of the community. The one cannot be cultivated apart from the other." Owenites critiqued Emerson's self-reliance as a romantic ideal that ignored the economic realities of the working class. They pointed out that a philosophy that celebrates personal autonomy without addressing the material dependencies that bind people together could, in practice, legitimize social inequality. For them, education and political reform needed to be grounded in communal institutions that guaranteed basic needs, rather than in a lofty appeal to inner virtue alone. These 19th-century communalist critiques echo a later, more systematic philosophical challenge raised by the Canadian-American thinker Charles Taylor. In his seminal work, The Ethics of Authenticity, Taylor argues that the modern emphasis on individual autonomy can become hollow when it is divorced from a sense of belonging to a shared horizon of meaning. He writes, "Authenticity is not the solitary proclamation of a private self. It is the articulation of a self that is already shaped by, and in dialogue with, the traditions, languages, and communal narratives that give it depth." Taylor's communitarian critique suggests that Emerson's radical individualism may overlook the pre-existing cultural and historical frameworks that make self-trust possible in the first place. If we accept Taylor's point, then Emerson's project must be read not as a call to abandon community, but as an invitation to reimagine community in a way that honors both individual moral agency and collective responsibility. How does Emerson respond, implicitly or explicitly, to these concerns? One way to see his answer is in his repeated emphasis on the universal that flows through every individual mind. He writes in Nature, "The currents of the universal are in each of us. We are not islands, but waves of a greater ocean." By locating the source of moral insight in a universal spirit, Emerson suggests that the individual's inner voice is already a conduit for a larger moral order. In other words, the self is not an isolated atom. It is a node in a network of shared spiritual reality. This metaphysical framing provides a bridge between personal autonomy and communal duty. If each person taps into the same universal current, then the moral conclusions reached individually will, in principle, converge toward common ethical imperatives, such as the abolition of slavery or the nurturing of democratic participation. Emerson's educational philosophy further illustrates this bridge. In politics, he argues that education should cultivate the capacity to think for oneself, to discern the divine within, and to act upon that discernment. He opposes rote memorization and the narrow curricula of the time, urging instead a broad and free education that encourages students to explore literature, philosophy, and the natural world. Yet he also insists that education must serve the public good. He writes, "The educated citizen is the cornerstone of a healthy republic. His self-reliance becomes the engine of collective progress." Here we see an explicit link. The development of the autonomous mind is not an end in itself, but a means to strengthen the democratic community. The individual's intellectual growth is expected to translate into civic engagement, moral leadership, and a more just society. To bring this into sharper focus, consider the example of the early public school movement in Massachusetts. The state's pioneering school laws of the 1830s and 1840s sought to create a common curriculum that would produce informed citizens. While some critics, like the Owenites, argued that these schools reinforced a utilitarian, state-controlled model, Emerson saw them as an opportunity for individuals to discover their inner voice within a communal setting. He wrote to a friend, "Let the school be a garden where each child may plant his own seed, yet all may share the sunlight of truth." In this metaphor, the school is both a private plot for personal growth and a shared space where the common light of knowledge nurtures everyone. The tension between the private and the public, then, is not a contradiction but a dynamic interplay. The historical anecdote of the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention offers another lens through which to view Emerson's influence. Although Emerson himself did not attend the convention, his essays on self-trust and moral independence resonated strongly with the women's rights activists who gathered there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in her opening address, invoked the spirit of Emersonian individualism, declaring, "We claim for ourselves the same right to self-determination that the American scholar claims for the mind." The convention's Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, framed the struggle for women's suffrage as a matter of individual moral rights that must be recognized by the community. In this way, Emerson's ideas filtered into a broader social movement, providing an intellectual foundation for demanding that the community honor the autonomy of each member, regardless of gender. Yet the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century would challenge Emerson's balance. Reformers like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House, emphasized the importance of social institutions and collective action to address urban poverty, public health, and labor rights. Addams wrote, "The good of the community must be the goal of every individual effort." Her settlement house model embodied a communal ethic that sometimes seemed at odds with Emerson's insistence on personal moral agency. Progressive reformers argued that without robust social structures, public health systems, labor regulations, child welfare laws, the individual's capacity to act virtuously would be undermined by material deprivation and social injustice. The tension between Emersonian self-trust and progressive collectivism became a recurring theme in American intellectual history, prompting scholars to ask whether the nation could sustain a robust individualism without a strong safety net. To understand how this tension played out, let us imagine two neighboring towns in the 1890s. In the first, a small New England village, the local schoolmaster, inspired by Emerson's American Scholar, encourages each student to read poetry, reflect on nature, and develop a personal voice. The school's curriculum is light on vocational training, heavy on critical thinking. In the second town, a burgeoning industrial city, a settlement house led by a group of progressive reformers offers night classes, job placement services, and health clinics. Here, the emphasis is on equipping individuals with the skills and support needed to survive in a rapidly changing economy. Both towns aim to improve the lives of their citizens, but they do so from different philosophical starting points. One from the inner moral compass, the other from external structural support. The dialogue between these approaches, whether they complement or conflict, mirrors the larger American debate that Emerson helped to shape. Returning to Emerson's own words, we find a nuanced acknowledgement of this balance. In Self-Reliance, he famously declares, "A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within." Yet he also warns, society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the benefit of the whole, to put up a certain capital, in the form of their own individuality. The metaphor of a joint stock company suggests that each individual's contribution, his capital of self-trust, is meant to serve a collective enterprise. The image of a shared investment underscores that personal autonomy is not a withdrawal from the public sphere, but a deposit that yields communal dividends. Let us now examine the concrete historical episode of Emerson's 1844 anti-slavery speech more closely. The Tremont Temple audience was a mixture of abolitionist activists, clergy, and ordinary Boston citizens. Emerson opened with a vivid image. Imagine a candle lit in a dark room, its flame trembling yet steadfast. That candle is the conscience of each man. When we gather those candles, the darkness is dispelled. He then invoked the American Revolution, reminding his listeners that the very foundation of the nation rested on the principle that all men are created equal. He argued that the existence of slavery was a betrayal of that founding promise, a moral wound that could not be healed by legislation alone. The law, he said, cannot give what the heart must first recognize. The speech concluded with a call to personal action. Each of us must become a lantern for liberty, shining our own light into the darkness of oppression. The resonance of this speech lay in its ability to translate a lofty philosophical principle, self-reliance and moral intuition, into a concrete political imperative. The correspondence with Thoreau during the Civil War adds another layer to this translation. In a letter dated October 1863, Emerson wrote, "Your refusal to pay the poll tax is a small act, yet it reverberates like a stone dropped into a still pond." The ripples reach far beyond the immediate injustice. He praised Thoreau's willingness to endure personal hardship for the sake of principle, emphasizing that the authenticity of one's inner conviction can become a catalyst for broader social change. Thoreau's later essay, Civil Disobedience, would echo this sentiment, arguing that the only obligation which a citizen has toward the government is to be faithful to his conscience. Emerson's encouragement of Thoreau illustrates how he saw the individual's moral stance as a seed that could grow into a collective movement, especially in moments of national crisis. Now let us turn to the Fourierist critique in more detail. Charles Fourier, a French utopian socialist, proposed that society be reorganized into self-sustaining communities where work was aligned with personal passions. He believed that the alienation produced by industrial labor could be remedied by structuring society to accommodate the passions of the heart. Fourier wrote, "When the individual is placed where his natural inclinations can flourish, the community prospers as a natural consequence." From this perspective, Emerson's focus on inner moral intuition might appear insufficient because it does not address the material conditions that shape those intuitions. If a person is forced into an oppressive labor environment, can they truly exercise self-reliance? Fourier would answer no, arguing that true self-trust requires a social framework that nurtures the individual's passions. He saw Emerson's idealism as a beautiful but incomplete portrait of human flourishing. Robert Owen's communal experiments offer a similar challenge. At New Harmony, Owen attempted to create a society where workers shared the fruits of their labor, children were raised collectively, and education was universal. Owen's pamphlet, A New View of Society, declared, "The improvement of the individual is inseparable from the improvement of the community. The two must advance hand in hand." He argued that without communal ownership of resources and a democratic governance structure, the individual's moral development would be hampered by economic exploitation. Owen's critics of Emerson would point to the fact that Emerson, while morally opposed to slavery, did not propose a concrete economic restructuring to address the systemic exploitation of laborers in the burgeoning industrial economy. For Owen, the moral imperative must be matched by material transformation. The modern communitarian critique, articulated by Charles Taylor, adds a philosophical dimension to these 19th century concerns. Taylor argues that modern conceptions of autonomy often become atomistic, reducing individuals to isolated decision-makers detached from the narratives that give their choices meaning. He writes, "Our identities are always already shaped by the languages, traditions, and communal practices that we inherit." In this view, Emerson's call for self-trust risks overlooking the fact that the very capacity to trust oneself is cultivated within a cultural context. Taylor would suggest that Emerson's philosophy should be read as a call to deepen the quality of the cultural narratives that inform the self, rather than to abandon those narratives altogether. He emphasizes that authenticity is achieved not by rejecting community, but by engaging with it in a way that allows the self to be both rooted and free. This critique invites us to reconsider Emerson's radical individualism as a starting point for a more dialogical relationship between self and society. How does this dialogue manifest in the evolution of American thought? The tension between Emersonian self-trust and the later progressive era reforms can be traced through the writings of figures like John Stuart Mill, whose utilitarian emphasis on the greatest happiness for the greatest number seemed to clash with Emerson's focus on personal moral intuition. Yet both shared a belief in the capacity of individuals to shape society. In the early 20th century, the progressive reformers, such as Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, championed regulations, antitrust laws, and social welfare programs. Their agenda was premised on the idea that unchecked individual competition could lead to social harm, and that the state must intervene to protect the common good. The progressive impulse thus represents a collective response to the perceived excesses of unbridled individualism, while still relying on the belief that an informed, morally conscious citizenry could steer the nation toward justice. The intellectual lineage continues into contemporary discussions about civic engagement and social responsibility. When we examine modern movements, whether climate activism, racial justice protests, or grassroots education initiatives, we often hear the same Emersonian refrain. We must trust our inner conviction and act. Yet these movements also recognize the necessity of organized structures, collective bargaining, and policy advocacy. The synthesis of individual moral clarity with organized communal effort remains a central challenge, echoing Emerson's own attempt to weave together the strands of self-reliance and social duty. Consider for a moment an analogy that captures this synthesis. Imagine a river flowing through a landscape. Each drop of water represents an individual mind, moving according to its own momentum, yet inevitably joining with countless other drops to form a larger current. The river's power comes from both the individual drops and their collective flow. If a single drop tries to resist the current, it may splash, but it cannot alter the river's direction. Conversely, if the river is dammed, each drop is confined, unable to fulfill its potential. Emerson's philosophy can be seen as an invitation to recognize the vitality of each drop while also understanding that the river's course, democracy, justice, education, shapes the possibilities for each drop's movement. The dam in this metaphor represents the oppressive structures, slavery, economic exploitation, authoritarianism, that block the natural flow of moral insight. The spillway, then, is the act of social responsibility, the deliberate opening of channels that allow the river to nourish the broader landscape. Historical anecdotes further illuminate this interplay. In 1849, Emerson attended the meeting of the Boston Lyceum, where he heard a young woman, Margaret Fuller, speak about women's education. Fuller, herself a pioneering feminist and fellow transcendentalist, argued that the mind of a woman, when allowed to breathe, becomes a source of light for the whole nation. Emerson responded by affirming that the expansion of educational opportunities for women was not a betrayal of his individualist principles, but an affirmation of them. He saw the empowerment of women as a necessary condition for the nation's moral growth. This encounter demonstrates how Emerson's ideas were not static, they were responsive to the evolving demands of the community. Another anecdote comes from the post-Civil War era, when Emerson visited the South to speak at a Reconstruction conference in 1866. He addressed a mixed audience of former slave owners, newly freed African Americans, and Northern reformers. He declared, "The true measure of a nation is not how it treats its strongest, but how it lifts its weakest." He appealed to the shared humanity of all present, urging them to let their inner moral compass guide the reconstruction of a fractured society. While some Southern listeners dismissed his words as Northern idealism, many African American leaders found in Emerson's emphasis on self-trust a rallying point for their own aspirations toward education and civic participation. The episode illustrates how Emerson's individualist ethos could be mobilized to support collective healing and societal restructuring. Emerson's influence also reverberates in the writings of later American thinkers. Henry David Thoreau, of course, took Emerson's call to inner authenticity and pushed it toward radical civil disobedience. John Muir, the naturalist and conservationist, echoed Emerson's reverence for nature as a source of moral insight while advocating for public policies to protect wilderness, an early example of individual reverence translating into communal environmental stewardship. In the 20th century, the philosopher John Dewey, though critical of some transcendentalist romanticism, appreciated Emerson's belief in the democratic potential of the reflective individual. Dewey's experience and education can be read as an attempt to operationalize Emersonian self-trust within a pragmatic framework of public schooling and democratic participation. Let us pause and consider a question that lies at the heart of this exploration. Can a society truly flourish when it places the individual at the center without a corresponding commitment to communal well-being? Or conversely, can a community thrive when it subsumes the individual's moral agency under collective norms? Emerson's work suggests that the answer lies not in a simple either/or, but in a dynamic tension, a dance between the inner light and the outer world. He invites us to see the individual as both a source and a recipient of communal values. He writes, "The man who is truly self-reliant does not withdraw from the world. He engages it, transforms it, and is transformed in return. This reciprocity is the cornerstone of his social dimension." In practice, this reciprocity can be observed in modern civic initiatives that blend personal conviction with collective action. Take, for example, the community garden movement in urban neighborhoods. A resident, moved by a personal belief in sustainability and self-sufficiency, decides to convert an abandoned lot into a garden. The act begins with an individual's inner resolve, but soon the garden becomes a communal space where neighbors share produce, teach each other gardening techniques, and hold cultural events. The garden embodies Emerson's ideal, an expression of individual self-reliance that blossoms into a communal resource. Likewise, the modern teach-in protest, where individuals gather to educate the public about climate science, reflects the same pattern, personal moral urgency giving rise to organized, collective learning. The tension between Emersonian self-trust and progressive reforms also appears in the debate over public versus private education. Progressive reformers argued for compulsory, state-run schools to ensure equal opportunity, while critics warned that such systems could stifle the individuality that Emerson prized. The contemporary charter school movement can be seen as a modern attempt to reconcile the two, schools that operate with public funding but retain the flexibility to innovate and nurture individual talents. Proponents claim that charter schools embody Emerson's spirit by allowing educators to trust their own pedagogical instincts while still serving the public good. Critics, however, point out that without robust oversight, such schools can become enclaves that exacerbate inequality, once again highlighting the delicate balance between individual autonomy and communal responsibility. Returning to the counterarguments, the Fourierist and Owenite critiques remind us that any philosophy of self-reliance must grapple with the material conditions that enable or constrain moral agency. If individuals are trapped in poverty, lack access to education, or are subjected to systemic racism, their capacity to exercise self-trust is compromised. Emerson, aware of these realities, did not shy away from political engagement. His anti-slavery speech, his support for public education, and his correspondence with activists demonstrate an awareness that moral insight must be paired with concrete action. Yet he never offered a detailed blueprint for economic restructuring, perhaps because he believed that moral transformation would precede and inspire structural change. This belief aligns with his broader view that the soul of the nation is reflected in the moral health of its citizens. Modern communitarian critiques, such as those offered by Charles Taylor, push this point further by insisting that identity is always already communal. Taylor's argument that authenticity requires engagement with shared narratives suggests that Emerson's call for self-trust must be situated within a cultural context that nurtures that trust. In other words, the individual's inner voice is not a solitary whisper in a vacuum. It is a chorus that has been rehearsed within a community's traditions, language, and shared history. When we examine Emerson's own life, we see that his ideas were shaped by the intellectual salons of Boston, the Transcendentalist meetings at Brook Farm, and the broader currents of American Romanticism. His philosophy, then, is both a product of and a response to the communal forces of his time. The cross-reference to later progressive reforms underscores how the American imagination has continually wrestled with this balance. The progressive era's emphasis on regulation, public health, and social welfare can be read as a response to the excesses of an unbridled laissez-faire capitalism that seemed to betray the moral promise of self-reliance. Yet the progressive reforms also drew on the same belief in the capacity of individuals to improve society, a belief that Emerson championed. The reforms sought to create a framework in which individuals could exercise their moral agency without being crushed by systemic oppression. In this sense, the progressive agenda can be seen as an attempt to institutionalize Emersonian ideals, translating the inner moral compass into public policy. To bring these threads together, let us imagine a contemporary scenario that captures the essence of Emerson's social dimension. A college student inspired by a reading of Self-Reliance decides to start a peer-to-peer tutoring program for underprivileged high school students. The student's motivation springs from a personal conviction that education is a moral imperative, a belief that aligns with Emerson's emphasis on the inner calling toward knowledge. As the program expands, it attracts volunteers, secures funding from local businesses, and partners with public schools. The initiative becomes a community asset, improving educational outcomes and fostering a sense of shared purpose. The student's original act of self-trust has blossomed into a collective enterprise that embodies both individual moral agency and communal benefit. This modern example mirrors Emerson's own life. A single voice rooted in personal conviction, resonating outward to shape the world. In reflecting on Emerson's reconciliation of radical individualism with social responsibility, we might ask ourselves, what does it mean to be truly self-reliant in a world that is increasingly interconnected? Is it enough to cultivate inner virtue, or must we also engage in the messy work of building institutions, confronting injustice, and nurturing communal bonds? Emerson seems to answer with a quiet confidence that the two are not separate tasks but facets of a single moral project. He urges us to listen to the inner voice but also to speak it into the world. He invites us to see our personal moral development as inseparable from the health of the democratic community, from the fight against oppression, and from the pursuit of an education that awakens the mind. The historical episodes we have examined, the 1844 anti-slavery speech, the wartime letters to Thoreau, the dialogues with women's rights advocates, the Reconstruction Address, show how Emerson lived out this principle. The critiques from Fourierists, Owenites, and modern communitarians remind us that the balance he sought is delicate and contested. The progressive era reforms demonstrate that the American project has continually revisited the question of how to align individual autonomy with collective welfare. As we move forward, the challenge remains to nurture the spark of self-trust within each person while ensuring that the flame is shared, that the light reaches the darkest corners, and that the communal hearth remains warm for all. In the final analysis, Emerson's social dimension offers a framework that is both aspirational and practical. It asks us to cultivate an inner moral compass, to trust our own judgments, and to act upon them with courage. At the same time, it calls us to recognize that our judgments are part of a larger moral conversation, a conversation that shapes laws, schools, and social movements. The individual is not an island but a lighthouse whose beam both guides and is guided by the sea of community. By holding this paradox in tension, Emerson invites each generation to imagine a society where personal authenticity fuels collective progress and where the health of the community nurtures the authenticity of each soul. This vision, though never fully realized, continues to echo through the corridors of American thought, urging us to ask, once more, how we might live true to ourselves while faithfully serving the common good. When we trace the winding river of American thought, it is impossible not to see the unmistakable current that begins with Ralph Waldo Emerson, rolls through the early 20th century, and continues to pulse in the self-help shelves of today's bookstores. Emerson's conviction that the individual is a source of inexhaustible insight, what he famously called the transparent eyeball, has become a kind of intellectual DNA, grafted onto the limbs of pragmatism, the nervous system of modern mindfulness, and even the glittering slogans of New Age spirituality. In this segment, we will follow that lineage, pausing to listen to the exact words that philosophers quoted, to hear the anecdotes that reveal how a 19th century essay could inspire a 1909 lecture series and a 1970s rock anthem, and to consider the critical voices that have questioned the very foundations of Emerson's self-reliance. Let us begin with the first major branch that sprouted from Emerson's fertile ground, American pragmatism. The pragmatist trio, Charles S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, each in their own way, took Emerson's insistence on experience as the ultimate arbiter of truth and reshaped it into a method for solving philosophical problems. Peirce, the logician who coined the term pragmatism, wrote in his 1878 paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, that the meaning of an idea is to be sought in the conceivable practical effects of the object of the idea. He was, in effect, Echoing Emerson's claim in Nature that the world is a great book and we are the reader. Peirce explicitly acknowledged Emerson's influence in a letter to his friend William James, noting that Emerson's faith in the living, ever-changing experience of the individual provided a vivid illustration of the very principle we are trying to articulate. William James, perhaps the most vocal disciple of Emerson within pragmatism, made the connection unmistakable in his 1907 lecture series, later published as The Will to Believe. James quoted Emerson verbatim, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string." He used that line to argue that belief is not a passive acceptance of external authority, but an active, personal commitment that can be justified by its practical consequences. In the same lecture, James cited Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, as a touchstone for his own argument that the truth of an idea is measured by its ability to work in the lived experience of the individual. James's famous cash value test, "the true is only the name given to whatever works," resonates with Emerson's assertion that the only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. John Dewey, the third pillar of pragmatism, carried Emerson's emphasis on the dynamic, ever-evolving self into the realm of education and democracy. In his 1938 work Experience and Education, Dewey wrote, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled," a sentiment that mirrors Emerson's metaphor of the soul as a lamp that must be kept burning by the inward light. Dewey explicitly credited Emerson for inspiring his view that knowledge is not a static accumulation of facts but an active, participatory process. In a 1916 essay, The Influence of Emerson on Modern Thought, Dewey quoted the essayist's line, "A man is what he thinks about all day long," to illustrate his own belief that habits of thought shape the very fabric of democratic life. These three pragmatists did not merely echo Emerson. They transformed his poetic optimism into a systematic approach to philosophy, one that demanded that ideas be tested in the crucible of lived experience. The chain of quotation, Emerson to Peirce to James to Dewey, creates a clear genealogical line, a kind of intellectual relay where each runner carries the baton of experience as proof across the finish line of modern thought. The influence did not stop at the academy. By the early 20th century, Emerson's ideas had begun to seep into a cultural movement that would later be labeled self-help. One of the earliest and most prominent figures to draw directly from Emerson was Norman Vincent Peale, whose 1952 bestseller, The Power of Positive Thinking, opened with a nod to the Transcendentalist's confidence in the individual's inner resources. Peale quoted Emerson's famous admonition, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us," positioning it as the philosophical backbone for his own prescription of affirmations and visualizations. Peale's language, while more overtly religious than Emerson's, nevertheless relies on the same premise, that the individual possesses an inner reservoir of strength that, if accessed, can reshape reality. A few decades later, the New Age author Deepak Chopra would echo Emerson in a very different context. In his 1995 book, The 7 Spiritual Laws of Success, Chopra writes, "The universe is a field of possibilities, and we are the conscious agents who can tap into it." He explicitly cites Emerson's line from The Oversoul. The soul is a universe, a world of its own. Chopra's synthesis of Eastern metaphysics and Emersonian individualism creates a hybrid that resonates with contemporary audiences seeking both spiritual depth and personal empowerment. The quote is not merely decorative. It serves as a bridge linking the 19th century American ideal of self-reliance with the 20th century belief in the mind's ability to influence matter, a belief that underpins much of modern mindfulness and manifestation culture. Mindfulness, as it is practiced in yoga studios and corporate wellness programs today, also bears Emerson's fingerprints. The practice's emphasis on present moment awareness, be here now, mirrors Emerson's insistence that the individual must attend to the inner voice rather than the external noise. In a 2003 interview, Jon Kabat-Zinn, founder of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, referenced Emerson's assertion that the only way to have a friend is to be one, interpreting it as a reminder that compassion begins with self-recognition. Kabat-Zinn's framing of mindfulness as a democratic practice, available to anyone regardless of status, echoes Emerson's belief that the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps on his own. To see how these ideas traveled from the lecture hall to the popular imagination, let us pause for an anecdote that illustrates the immediacy of Emerson's impact on his intellectual heirs. In 1909, William James, already a towering figure in American philosophy, published a series of lectures under the title The Emersonian Philosophy. The work was not a mere commentary. It was a bold declaration that Emerson's thought constituted a distinct philosophical system worthy of rigorous study. James opened the first lecture with a direct quotation. "The greatest delight which the fields and woods minister to the spirit is the feeling of being at one with nature." He then argued that this feeling is the empirical basis for a metaphysics of experience, a claim that would later inform the development of phenomenology. The book was received with both admiration and skepticism, but its very existence signaled that Emerson had moved from the margins of literary criticism into the core of philosophical discourse. The publication spurred a wave of scholarly articles, many of which attempted to reconcile Emerson's romanticism with the emerging scientific worldview, a reconciliation that would become a hallmark of pragmatism. Fast forward to the 1970s, a decade marked by cultural upheaval, experimentation, and a renewed interest in mysticism. It was during this period that self-reliance experienced a revival, not only in academic circles, but also in the realms of music and literature. The rock band The Doors, in their 1972 album An American Prayer, included a spoken word track that directly quoted Emerson's essay, "A man is what he thinks about all day long." Jim Morrison's gravelly voice, layered over a hypnotic organ drone, turned Emerson's philosophical claim into a lyrical mantra, resonating with a generation seeking authenticity amid social turbulence. Simultaneously, the poet and novelist Tom Mason, in his 1975 collection The New Transcendentalists, republished Self-Reliance with a modern preface that framed Emerson's ideas as a counter-cultural critique of consumerist conformity. The preface quoted bell hooks, who, though later, would become a prominent feminist critic, to foreshadow the gendered tensions that would emerge. This dual revival, musical and literary, demonstrates how Emerson's call to trust oneself could be reinterpreted as both a personal empowerment anthem and a rallying cry for social dissent. Yet as Emerson's ideas proliferated, they also attracted rigorous critique. Feminist scholar bell hooks, in her 1984 work Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, challenged the gendered implications of self-reliance. Hooks argued that Emerson's ideal of the autonomous individual, while liberating in theory, often presupposes a male subject who is already privileged by social structures. She wrote, "The myth of the self-made man ignores the labor of women, whose self-reliance is routinely devalued and whose interdependence is framed as weakness." In this reading, Emerson's call to trust thyself becomes a double-edged sword. It encourages personal agency, but can also obscure systemic inequalities that make true self-reliance unattainable for many. Hooke's critique forces us to ask, when we celebrate the power of the individual, whose voices are we silencing? A parallel line of criticism comes from the post-colonial perspective, most famously articulated by Edward Said in his seminal work Culture and Imperialism, 1993. Said examined the way American exceptionalism, an idea that resonates with Emerson's assertion that America is the only country where the people have the right to be different, functioned as a cultural justification for expansion and domination. He argued that Emerson's celebration of the American spirit, while inspiring, also contributed to a narrative that positioned the United States as a moral beacon, thereby marginalizing non-Western perspectives. Said wrote, "The Emersonian confidence in the self-sufficient individual becomes, in the national imagination, a metaphor for the nation's presumed moral superiority." This reading invites us to reconsider the broader implications of Emerson's philosophy when it is extrapolated from the personal to the political. These feminist and post-colonial critiques do not nullify Emerson's contributions. Rather, they enrich the conversation, urging us to view his legacy through a more nuanced lens. They remind us that any philosophical system, however luminous, must be examined for the shadows it casts. In the same spirit, we can turn to the cross-currents that have historically flowed between Emerson's Transcendentalism and Eastern mysticism. Emerson himself was an avid reader of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and the writings of Hindu and Buddhist scholars. In his essay The Oversoul, he wrote, "The soul is a universe, a world of its own," a sentiment that resonates with the Hindu concept of Brahman as the all-pervading reality. The Beat generation of the 1950s and 1960s, figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Gary Snyder, absorbed Emerson's emphasis on intuition and direct experience, merging it with Eastern practices such as Zen meditation. In Ginsberg's poem Howl, the line, "Who never stopped to think that the universe is a single, indivisible whole," can be read as a poetic echo of Emerson's The Oversoul. Kerouac, in his novel On the Road, referenced Emerson's call to go confidently in the direction of your dreams as a guiding principle for his character's restless wanderings. These beat writers often quoted Emerson alongside verses from the Tao Te Ching, illustrating a syncretic worldview that transcended cultural boundaries. Their work demonstrates how Emerson's focus on the inner voice dovetailed with Eastern practices that also privilege direct, non-conceptual insight. To further illustrate the practical reach of Emersonian thought, consider two concrete examples from contemporary life. First, the corporate leadership training program known as the Emerson Initiative, launched by a Fortune 500 company in 2015, structures its curriculum around Emerson's belief that the only way to have a friend is to be one. The program encourages employees to develop authentic relationships, emphasizing empathy and self-awareness as pathways to better teamwork. The training modules cite Emerson's essay Friendship verbatim, using the passage, "A man is a god in the making and his own best friend," as a rallying cry for personal development. Second, the popular meditation app Calm features a daily quote section that frequently draws from Emerson's essays. One of its most streamed quotes is, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Users report that this line, presented with a gentle chime, serves as a reminder to center themselves amid digital distractions. These examples show how Emerson's language has been commodified, yet still retains its capacity to inspire individual reflection. Returning to the academic lineage, it is worth noting how later philosophers have built upon the pragmatic reinterpretation of Emerson. Richard Rorty, a late 20th century pragmatist, explicitly invoked Emerson in his 1979 essay, The Pragmatic Turn. Rorty quoted Emerson's claim that the only thing that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing, to argue that philosophical discourse should be oriented towards social progress rather than abstract metaphysics. Rorty's ironism, the recognition that our vocabularies are contingent, finds a precursor in Emerson's acknowledgement that the world is a great book and we are the reader. This continuity demonstrates that Emerson's influence has not been static. It has been reinterpreted, reshaped, and repurposed across generations. In the realm of literature, the novelist Toni Morrison, in her 1992 novel Jazz, references Emerson's idea that the greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Though Morrison does not name Emerson directly, the sentiment permeates the novel's exploration of resilience amid the African-American experience. By embedding Emersonian motifs within narratives that foreground marginalized voices, contemporary writers are both honoring and recontextualizing his legacy. The modern mindfulness movement, too, offers a compelling case study of Emerson's indirect influence. Jon Kabat-Zinn's seminal book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, includes a passage that reads, "If we are to be truly free, we must be able to look at ourselves without judgment." This mirrors Emerson's declaration in Self-Reliance that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Both texts caution against the tyranny of rigid self-concepts and encourage a fluid, open-hearted engagement with the present moment. The overlap is not coincidental. Mindfulness practitioners often trace their lineage to both Buddhist meditation and the American Transcendentalist tradition, acknowledging Emerson as a bridge between the two. Let us revisit the 1909 anecdote of William James's The Emersonian Philosophy for a moment. James's decision to compile Emerson's essays into a systematic philosophical work was itself an act of self-reliance, an intellectual gamble that risked marginalizing the more poetic aspects of Emerson's writing in favor of a disciplined analysis. Yet James also preserved Emerson's lyrical voice, allowing future scholars to hear the original cadence. In a review published in The Atlantic that same year, the critic Charles B. Morrison wrote, "James has not merely edited Emerson. He has given him a new stage on which his ideas can perform for a modern audience." This endorsement helped cement Emerson's place in the academic canon, ensuring that his ideas would continue to be interrogated and applied. Contrast this with the 1970s New Age revival of Self-Reliance. The revival was less about scholarly analysis and more about cultural appropriation. In a 1978 interview with the Rolling Stone magazine, folk rock musician Joni Mitchell explained how she incorporated Emerson's lines into her song, The Circle Game. Noting that the idea that you have to trust yourself, even when the world tells you otherwise, feels like a protest anthem for the soul. This artistic reinterpretation stripped Emerson of his philosophical rigor, recasting his words as a lyrical slogan. Yet paradoxically, this simplification made his ideas accessible to a broader audience, embedding them in the cultural consciousness of a generation that sought meaning beyond material success. The duality of Emerson's legacy, both as a rigorous philosophical foundation and as a source of popular inspiration, raises an essential question. Can a single set of ideas sustain such divergent applications without losing coherence? The answer may lie in the very nature of Emerson's thought. He wrote, "The only way to have a friend is to be one," suggesting that ideas, like friendships, evolve through interaction. When philosophers quote him, they are not merely citing a static text, they are entering into a dialogue, reshaping the original meaning to fit new contexts. When self-help authors invoke his lines, they are engaging in a different kind of conversation, one that seeks to empower the individual in a world that often feels fragmented. Both dialogues are legitimate, as long as we remain aware of the interpretive lenses we bring to the conversation. Consider, for instance, the way contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, integrates Emersonian principles. CBT encourages clients to examine and reframe maladaptive thoughts, a process that echoes Emerson's admonition to trust thyself and be yourself. The therapist's role is akin to the Emersonian transparent eyeball, observing thoughts without judgment and allowing the individual's inner truth to surface. In a 2018 article in Psychology Today, Dr. Susan Davidson wrote, Emerson's emphasis on self-reliance aligns closely with the CBT premise that individuals have the capacity to change their mental narratives. This alignment illustrates how Emerson's ideas have migrated from philosophical treatises to clinical practice, influencing how we understand mental health. Yet the feminist and post-colonial critiques remind us that such migrations are not neutral. When CBT, for example, promotes self-reliance as a universal remedy, it may inadvertently overlook structural factors, such as gendered expectations or racial oppression, that constrain an individual's agency. Bell Hooks would argue that true empowerment must address both the internal and external dimensions of oppression. Edward Said would caution that framing the American psyche as a model of self-reliance can reinforce a cultural hegemony that marginalizes non-Western conceptions of community and interdependence. These perspectives compel us to interrogate the ethical dimensions of applying Emersonian thought in therapeutic contexts. In the realm of political philosophy, Emerson's influence can be traced to contemporary debates about liberty and community. The libertarian thinker Robert Nozick, in his 1974 work Anarchy, State, and Utopia, referenced Emerson's notion that the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps on his own, to argue for a minimal state that respects individual autonomy. Conversely, communitarian scholars such as Michael Sandel have critiqued this individualistic thrust, invoking Emerson's own paradoxical statements about the interdependence of souls to argue for a more relational understanding of the self. Sandel writes, while Emerson celebrates the solitary self, he also acknowledges that the soul is a universe, a world of its own, implying an inherent connectedness that libertarian readings often neglect. This dialectic illustrates how Emerson's writings can be marshaled to support divergent political ideologies, depending on which passages are foregrounded. To appreciate the breadth of Emerson's cultural resonance, we must also examine his impact on visual arts. The American painter Georgia O'Keeffe, in a 1935 interview, described her approach to abstraction as an attempt to see the world through the transparent eyeball of the soul, directly quoting Emerson's Nature. O'Keeffe's large-scale flowers and desert landscapes embody the Transcendentalist belief that the material world is a conduit for spiritual insight. Similarly, the abstract expressionist Mark Rothko, whose color fields evoke a meditative stillness, cited Emerson's essays as a source of inspiration, noting that the soul's yearning for the infinite can be expressed through color as it can through words. These artistic testimonies demonstrate that Emerson's philosophical language transcended the written page, influencing how artists visualize the relationship between inner experience and outer form. Returning to the Beat Generation, we encounter a vivid anecdote that illustrates the cross-pollination of Emersonian and Eastern ideas. In 1957, Allen Ginsberg attended a public reading of Emerson's Self-Reliance at the San Francisco Poetry Center. Ginsberg later recalled when Emerson spoke of trusting oneself. I heard the echo of the Buddhist koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping, both urging a direct encounter with the self beyond intellectual constructs. Ginsberg's poem Kaddish incorporates this synthesis, juxtaposing Emersonian self-reliance with Buddhist impermanence, thereby creating a hybrid spiritual language that resonated with the countercultural movements of the 1960s. The influence of Emerson on contemporary self-help literature is perhaps most evident in the proliferation of manifestation books. Rhonda Bynes' The Law of Attraction, 2006, opens with an Emerson quote. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Bayon's premise that thoughts can shape reality mirrors Emerson's belief in the creative power of the inner mind. Critics argue that such claims oversimplify complex psychological processes, yet the popularity of these texts underscores the enduring appeal of Emerson's promise that the individual holds the key to transformation. In juxtaposing these modern manifestations with the earlier pragmatic lineage, we see an intriguing shift. Pragmatism emphasized the communal testing of ideas, while contemporary self-help often foregrounds solitary empowerment. This shift raises a question about the direction of Emerson's legacy. Are we moving toward a more isolated conception of the self, or are we rediscovering the communal dimensions that Dewey and later communitarians emphasized? The answer may lie in the current mindfulness movement, which strives to balance personal well-being with collective responsibility. Programs such as Insight Timer incorporate community features, group meditations, shared reflections, suggesting a synthesis of Emerson's individualistic ethos with a broader sense of shared humanity. Let us now consider the role of Emerson's ideas in the digital age. Social media platforms, with their emphasis on personal branding and self-expression, seem to embody the spirit of self-reliance. Yet, they also create paradoxes. The pursuit of authenticity is mediated through algorithms that reward conformity. In a 2021 essay, digital theorist Sherry Turkle wrote, "We are encouraged to trust ourselves, but the feedback loops of likes and shares shape what we think we are." Turkle's observation echoes bell Hooks's critique that the myth of self-reliance can mask the subtle ways in which social structures influence personal identity. The digital realm thus becomes a new arena where Emersonian ideals are both tested and contested. To further illuminate the historical depth of Emerson's influence, we can turn to a lesser-known anecdote from the early 20th century. In 1913, the poet Wallace Stevens, then a young literary critic, attended a lecture by William James on Emersonian philosophy. Stevens later wrote in a private journal, "James's reading of Emerson made me see the poem as a philosophical act, a way of naming the invisible currents that move through the mind." This moment of intellectual cross-fertilization contributed to Stevens' development of a poetic style that blended modernist experimentation with transcendentalist reverence for the inner world. Stevens' later poem, The Idea of Order at Key West, can be read as an artistic embodiment of Emerson's claim that the universe is a great book and we are the reader, suggesting that the act of creation is itself a form of reading the cosmos. Another historical vignette involves the 1930s American philosopher and educator John Culver, who organized a series of public seminars titled Emerson and the Modern World. Culver invited both pragmatists and New Age thinkers to discuss how Emerson's ideas could address the social crises of the Great Depression. One of the speakers, a young Alina Rash, argued that the self-reliant individual must also be a responsible citizen, thereby bridging the gap between Emerson's individualism and the collective needs of a society in distress. These seminars, though short-lived, foreshadowed later attempts to reconcile personal empowerment with social justice, a tension that continues to animate contemporary debates. In the contemporary academic sphere, the interdisciplinary field of environmental humanities often invokes Emerson's reverence for nature. In a 2019 symposium on eco-criticism and transcendentalism, scholar Karen Stinson quoted Emerson's description of nature as the visible symbol of the invisible, to argue that ecological activism can be grounded in a spiritual appreciation of the natural world. Stinson's work demonstrates how Emerson's poetic language can serve as a bridge between scientific concern for climate change and a moral imperative rooted in the human experience of wonder. This synthesis resonates with modern movements such as deep ecology, which echo Emerson's call to view the natural world not merely as a resource, but as a partner in the journey of self-discovery. To bring these threads together, let us reflect on a passage from Emerson's own essay, The American Scholar, delivered as a speech to the Harvard Divinity School in 1837. He proclaimed, "The one great function of the scholar is to interpret, to translate, to make known to the world the thoughts of the past, the present, and the future." In the centuries since, scholars, musicians, therapists, and entrepreneurs have each taken up this mantle, interpreting Emerson's words for their own eras. The pragmatists translated his poetic optimism into a method of inquiry. The self-help authors transformed his calls for inner trust into practical exercises. The Beats turned his reverence for intuition into lyrical rebellion. Feminist and post-colonial critics have reread his texts to expose blind spots. Mindfulness teachers have woven his reverence for the present into meditation practices. And digital creators have both celebrated and subverted his ideal of self-reliance in the age of algorithms. Each of these appropriations is a testament to Emerson's capacity to speak across time and discipline. Yet, as we listen to these varied voices, we must also hear the dissonance that arises when a single philosophical strand is stretched to fit disparate agendas. The feminist critique reminds us that the self-reliant man often excludes women's lived realities. The post-colonial reading warns that the celebration of an American individualist ethos can mask imperialist narratives. The digital age shows us that the promise of inner authenticity can be co-opted by market forces. In this light, Emerson's own humility, his admission in the Oversoul that the soul is a universe, a world of its own, and yet it is not a world apart from the world, offers a clue. He recognized the tension between the inner and the outer, between the solitary and the communal. Thus, when we map Emerson's intellectual descendants, we are not simply drawing a straight line from one thinker to another. We are charting a complex network of dialogues, disagreements, and reinterpretations. We see Peirce borrowing Emerson's trust in experience to formulate a pragmatic maxim. We see James invoking Emerson's self-trust to defend the right to believe. We see Dewey extending Emerson's vision of the mind as a fire to the classroom. We see Peale and Chopra turning Emerson's optimism into commercial self-help. We see bell hooks and Edward Said pulling Emerson's language apart to reveal its gendered and geopolitical dimensions. We see the Beats and mindfulness teachers weaving Emerson's reverence for intuition into poetry and meditation. We see contemporary artists and tech platforms repurposing his slogans for new audiences. In the final analysis, Emerson's legacy is less a monolith than a living conversation, a conversation that continues to evolve, to be challenged, and to inspire. As we close this exploration, consider Emerson's own invitation. Do not go where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path and blaze your own trail. May we, in listening to the echoes of his thought across pragmatism, self-help, mindfulness, and critique, blaze a trail that honors both the power of the individual and the responsibility we share with one another. The river that began with Emerson's pen still flows, winding through the valleys of philosophy, art, and everyday life, inviting each of us to dip our hands into its current and discover, once again, what lies within. When we turn a fresh eye toward Emerson, the first question that often rises unbidden is whether his celebrated call to self-reliance is a beacon of democratic empowerment or, paradoxically, a banner of quiet elitism. The American Transcendentalist, writing in the middle of the 19th century, seemed to believe that each individual carries within a spark of the divine, a capacity to rise above the ordinary constraints of society. Yet, as we will explore, that very confidence has been read in divergent ways, some seeing it as a rallying cry for the marginalized, others as a justification for a kind of spiritual aristocracy. In this segment, we will walk through the historical criticisms, the modern misreadings, the defenses offered by scholars such as Robert N. Bella, and finally, we will ask how Emerson's ideas might illuminate the pressing dilemmas of artificial intelligence, ecological collapse, and the renewal of democratic life. Let us begin with the accusation of elitism that has haunted Emerson ever since his essays first appeared in the pages of The Atlantic and The Dial. The Southern Agrarians, a collective of writers and critics who in the 1930s published the manifesto I'll Take My Stand, were among the earliest to brand Emerson's self-sufficient individual as a thin veneer for a kind of intellectual snobbery. John Crow Ransom, in his essay, The New Criticism, argued that Emerson's insistence on inner perfection excludes the common man, whose life is bound to the soil and the seasons. Alan Tate, another agrarian, went further, suggesting that Emerson's vision of the Oversoul, a universal spirit that unites all consciousness, creates a hierarchy of souls, where the few who can hear the Oversoul are elevated above those whose ears remain closed. The agrarians saw in Emerson a philosophical justification for the agrarian ideal of a rooted, community-bound life, and they read his transcendental optimism as a threat to that rootedness. Their critique was not merely literary, it was political, rooted in the South's struggle to preserve a way of life that felt imperiled by the industrial, individualistic ethos that Emerson seemed to champion. Fast forward to the present, and the accusation of elitism resurfaces in the language of social justice scholars. Kimberlé Crenshaw, in her work on intersectionality, has pointed out that calls for self-reliance often ignore the structural barriers that constrain the agency of women of color, low-income communities, and other historically marginalized groups. When an individual is told to trust thyself, without acknowledgement of the weight of systemic oppression, the phrase can become a veiled moral judgment. If you are not succeeding, it must be because you are not trying hard enough. This reading, echoed in the writings of bell hooks, frames Emerson's optimism as a form of spiritual capitalism, where the moral responsibility for success is shifted from the collective to the individual. In this sense, the criticism is not that Emerson's ideas are wrong, but that they have been deployed in ways that silence the very voices that need the most support. The next layer of critique comes from the commercial world, where Emerson's language has been co-opted, stripped of its philosophical depth, and repackaged as a marketing slogan. Think of the ubiquitous corporate tagline, "Be Yourself," that adorns everything from tech advertisements to lifestyle blogs. The phrase, lifted from Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, is often used to sell products that promise personal empowerment through consumption. The irony is palpable. A philosophy that urges individuals to look inward, to trust their own intuition, is transformed into a tool that encourages outward consumption. In the boardroom, executives might quote Emerson to justify a culture of disruptive innovation, arguing that employees must trust themselves and break free from tradition. Yet the original text, with its insistence on authenticity and moral independence, is reduced to a hollow catchphrase. The deeper ethical implications, about the responsibility to the community, the dangers of hubris, the necessity of humility before the oversoul, are lost in the shuffle. The commercialization of self-reliance thus becomes a misreading that not only dilutes Emerson's thought, but also reinforces a capitalist narrative that privileges individual success over collective well-being. A second, equally pervasive misreading concerns the oversoul, Emerson's most mystical concept. In The Oversoul, he writes, "The oversoul is a being that is more than any of us, but is also in each of us." Over time, this idea has been flattened into a vague spirituality, a sort of New Age mantra that suggests we are all connected, without any substantive philosophical grounding. Contemporary wellness influencers might invoke the oversoul to justify practices like energy healing or law of attraction, presenting it as an abstract, feel-good principle rather than a rigorous metaphysical claim. In doing so, they detach the oversoul from its original context, a critique of materialism, a call for an ethical unity that transcends individual ego, and a profound challenge to the mechanistic worldview of Emerson's industrial age. By rendering the oversoul into a nebulous, marketable spirituality, we lose the tension that Emerson cultivated between the individual and the universal, between personal intuition and a larger moral order. Having laid out these criticisms and misreadings, it is essential to pause and ask, are these failures of Emerson's thought or failures of its reception? Robert N. Bellah offers a compelling defense that reframes the conversation. In his seminal work, Religion and Human Evolution, Bellah reads Emerson through the lens of cultural sociology, arguing that Emerson's self-reliance is not a call for isolated individualism, but an invitation to participate in a larger moral community. Bellah suggests that Emerson's notion of the oversoul functions as a socially constructed symbol that binds individuals to a collective conscience. In this reading, self-reliance does not negate social responsibility. Rather, it equips the individual to act responsibly within a communal framework. Bellah points out that Emerson's essays repeatedly stress the importance of the social animal and the interdependence of all things. The famous line, "A man is a social animal," appears in Emerson's Nature, reminding us that his transcendental optimism is always anchored in the reality of human interconnection. Thus, the charge of elitism may stem more from a selective extraction of Emerson's ideas than from the ideas themselves. Further, Bellah notes that Emerson's emphasis on intuition is not a rejection of reason, but a call for a balanced epistemology. He writes that Emerson advocates a synthesis of the head and the heart, a synthesis that modern philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum have echoed in their discussions of capabilities and human flourishing. Nussbaum, in Frontiers of Justice, argues that a fully realized human being must have the capacity for both rational deliberation and emotional insight. In this sense, Emerson's insistence on inner guidance can be seen as an early articulation of what Nussbaum later calls the capabilities approach. By aligning Emerson with Nussbaum, we see that his philosophy does not stand in isolation. It anticipates contemporary debates about the conditions necessary for a dignified life. Let us return to the historical anecdotes that illuminate these tensions. In 1841, Emerson delivered a lecture titled The American Scholar, famously concluding with the line, "The American is a new man, a man who must be the poet of his own time." At that moment, the nation was still grappling with the aftermath of the Erie Canal, the rise of railroads, and the growing pains of a market economy. Emerson's call to the scholar was a call to shape a uniquely American culture, one that could stand apart from European tradition. Yet critics like Henry David Thoreau, his close friend and fellow transcendentalist, warned that this new man could become a solitary hermit if the community failed to nurture his growth. Thoreau's own experiment at Walden Pond, an act of deliberate withdrawal from society, was both a testament to Emerson's influence and a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive individualism. The anecdote of Thoreau's retreat serves as a reminder that Emerson's vision was never meant to be a total escape from society, but a reorientation toward a deeper, more authentic engagement with it. Another historical vignette comes from the 1930s, when the Southern agrarians gathered at Vanderbilt University to discuss the future of the South. Their manifesto, "I'll Take My Stand," directly references Emerson's self-reliance, but in a tone of irony. The agrarians argued that the South needed to return to a rootedness that Emerson's urban, industrial optimism seemed to deny. Yet, in a footnote, they concede that Emerson's idea of the oversoul could be reclaimed as a spiritual backbone for a community that values tradition. This ambivalence, both rejecting and appropriating Emerson, illustrates how his ideas have been caught in the crossfire of cultural battles, never fully belonging to one side or the other. Moving from the past to the present, we find that the misreadings of Emerson's thought have taken on new forms in the digital age. The phrase "trust your inner voice" now appears as a pop-up notification on mindfulness apps, accompanied by soothing chimes and a gentle reminder to breathe. The oversoul is rendered into a stylized logo for a yoga studio, its swirling lines meant to evoke a universal energy. In these contexts, the original philosophical rigor is replaced by aesthetic appeal. Yet this very diffusion offers an opportunity. It invites us to re-engage with the source material, to ask whether the modern appropriation can be redirected toward a deeper, more responsible ethic. One of the most promising avenues for such a re-engagement lies in the realm of artificial intelligence. As we stand on the cusp of an era where algorithmic decision-making shapes everything from hiring practices to criminal sentencing, Emerson's insistence on moral intuition becomes strikingly relevant. He wrote, "The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be." In the context of AI, this raises a crucial question: who decides the values that guide these machines? If we accept Emerson's claim that each individual carries an inner moral compass, then the design of AI systems must incorporate not only statistical efficiency, but also a cultivated sense of ethical discernment. This aligns with contemporary philosopher Shannon Valor's call for technomoral virtues, a set of character traits, such as humility, empathy, and responsibility, that developers should embody. Emerson's emphasis on self-reliance can be reframed here as a call for algorithmic self-reliance, where we demand that AI systems be transparent, accountable, and reflective of a shared moral imagination rather than a cold calculus. The ecological crisis offers another fertile ground for Emersonian insight. In Nature, Emerson declares, "The stars awaken a certain reverence, but the earth awakens a deeper love." He saw the natural world not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living presence that calls us to a higher ethical stance. This resonates with Timothy Morton's concept of dark ecology, which insists that we cannot separate human flourishing from the entangled, often unsettling, realities of the planetary web. Morton argues that we must move beyond a romanticized, green ideal and confront the messy, dark interdependencies that define our existence. Emerson's Oversoul can be read as an early articulation of this interconnectedness. The individual soul is not isolated but part of a larger cosmic consciousness. When we apply this to climate policy, the implication is clear. We must cultivate an inner sense of responsibility that transcends short-term self-interest, fostering a collective ethic that sees the health of the planet as inseparable from our own moral well-being. Democratic renewal, too, can be illuminated by Emerson's thought. In the age of hyper-partisanship, the notion that each citizen can become a self-reliant thinker is both a challenge and a promise. Emerson warned against the tyranny of the majority and urged individuals to listen to their own thoughts. Yet he also warned that self-reliance without communal dialogue leads to fragmentation. This tension mirrors contemporary debates about the role of deliberative democracy. Scholars such as Eugen Habermas emphasize the importance of communicative action, rational discourse that bridges private insight and public reasoning. Emerson's call for inner authenticity can be seen as a prerequisite for such discourse. Only when we have examined our own convictions can we engage meaningfully with others. Moreover, Martha Nussbaum's emphasis on public reason and the cultivation of emotional intelligence in citizenship dovetails with Emerson's belief that the heart and the mind must work together. In a world where social media amplifies echo chambers, Emerson's reminder to trust yourself, but also listen to the world becomes a vital corrective. Let us now examine the concrete examples that illustrate both the misreading and the faithful application of Emerson's ideas. The first example is the corporate branding of self-reliance by a major technology firm, which launched a global advertising campaign featuring a lone individual standing atop a mountain, arms outstretched. With the slogan, "Empower Yourself," the advertisement, while visually striking, glosses over the complex social infrastructure, education, healthcare, community support that makes any individual's empowerment possible. Critics pointed out that the campaign ignored the digital divide, the labor conditions of the workers who built the devices, and the environmental costs of producing such technology. Here, Emerson's call to trust thyself is transformed into a hollow promise that serves profit more than principle. The second example lies in the realm of spiritual entrepreneurship. A popular wellness brand sells a line of Oversoul incense, marketed as a conduit to the universal spirit within. The product description quotes Emerson's line, "The Oversoul is the source of all things," but offers no further context. Customers seeking a quick sense of connection light the incense and feel a fleeting sense of calm. Yet, the deeper philosophical challenge that Emerson posed, how to align personal intuition with a broader ethical responsibility, remains untouched. The Oversoul is reduced to a decorative label, stripped of its critical edge that questioned the materialist assumptions of Emerson's own time. In contrast, a community garden initiative in Detroit offers a more faithful embodiment of Emersonian principles. The project's organizers invoke Emerson's idea that the greatest delight which the fields and woods may offer is a feeling of the infinite. They frame the garden not merely as a source of fresh produce, but as a space where residents cultivate both food and a sense of shared purpose. By encouraging participants to listen to the land and trust their own hands, the garden becomes a living laboratory for the integration of self-reliance and communal care. The success of the garden, measured not only in pounds of vegetables, but in strengthened neighborhood ties, demonstrates how Emerson's vision can be operationalized without slipping into elitist abstraction. A third illustration, drawn from the academic sphere, shows how Emerson's Oversoul can be reimagined in interdisciplinary research. A team of philosophers, ecologists, and computer scientists at a university has launched a project called the Oversoul Network, aiming to model how individual agents in an ecosystem, human and non-human, interact through feedback loops that resemble a collective consciousness. They explicitly cite Emerson's essay, noting that the Oversoul is a being that is more than any of us, but is also in each of us, as a poetic metaphor for emergent properties in complex systems. By grounding this metaphor in rigorous mathematical modeling, the project avoids the vague spirituality that often plagues popular appropriations, while still honoring the spirit of Emerson's insight. Having examined these concrete cases, we return to the question of defense. Robert N. Bella's cultural sociological reading, as mentioned earlier, emphasizes that Emerson's self-reliance is embedded in a moral ecology that presupposes communal norms. Bella argues that Emerson's vision of the individual is not a lone wolf, but a social animal that draws its strength from shared narratives. This perspective aligns with the work of sociologist Emil Durkheim, who insisted that individual conscience is shaped by collective representations. By situating Emerson within this broader sociological framework, Bella neutralizes the charge of elitism, showing that the philosopher's call for authenticity is inseparable from the fabric of communal life. Another line of defense comes from contemporary feminist philosophers who reinterpret Emerson's ideas through a gendered lens. Sarah Ahmed, in her work on effective economies, points out that the self-reliant subject has historically been coded as masculine, while women's relational labor has been undervalued. Ahmed suggests that a rereading of Emerson can foreground the relational dimension of self-reliance, seeing it not as isolation, but as an interdependent network of effective ties. In this view, the Oversoul becomes a metaphor for relational solidarity, a shared affective field that binds individuals together. This feminist reinterpretation transforms Emerson's potential elitism into an invitation to reimagine the self as inherently relational. The cross references to other thinkers further enrich our analysis. When we compare Emerson to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, we notice both convergence and divergence. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch also calls for the creation of new values beyond conventional morality, yet Nietzsche is often read as a more radical individualist, one who explicitly rejects communal constraints. Emerson, by contrast, embeds his individualism within a moral universe that includes the Oversoul and a democratic ethos. This contrast helps us see that Emerson's self-reliance is not a nihilistic proclamation of personal will, but a hopeful affirmation that the individual can contribute to a higher moral order. Similarly, the environmental philosopher Timothy Morton's hyper-object theory, asserting that climate change is an entity so vast it transcends human comprehension, finds an unexpected ally in Emerson's reverence for the natural world. Both thinkers urge us to expand our perception beyond the immediate and to recognize a larger, often invisible, network of relations. While Morton emphasizes the unsettling, dark aspects of ecological entanglement, Emerson invites us to experience nature as a source of spiritual insight. Together, they suggest a philosophy that is both awe-inspiring and ethically demanding. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach offers another fruitful dialogue. Nussbaum argues that a just society must provide individuals with the real opportunities to develop essential capabilities: life, bodily health, emotions, practical reason, and affiliation. Emerson's insistence on inner development aligns with this, but Nussbaum adds a systematic framework that addresses structural inequities. By integrating Emerson's poetic vision with Nussbaum's analytic rigor, we can construct a more robust model for social justice that honors both inner moral growth and external material conditions. Having traversed the terrain of criticism, misreading, defense, and application, we now turn to the forward-looking analysis that ties Emerson's legacy to the most pressing issues of our time. First, in the realm of AI ethics, Emerson's call to trust thyself can be reframed as a call to embed human judgment within algorithmic processes. The notion of human-in-the-loop systems, where AI augments rather than replaces human decision-making, resonates with Emerson's belief that intuition and reason must cooperate. Moreover, his warning against mechanical conformity cautions us against allowing AI to ossify existing biases. By cultivating an Emersonian habit of reflective self-examination, developers and policymakers can ask, what values are we inscribing into these machines? Are we amplifying the voices of the privileged or creating space for the unheard? In this way, Emerson becomes a moral compass for a technologically mediated world. Second, regarding the ecological crisis, Emerson's reverence for the living present urges us to adopt a more intimate relationship with the environment. He wrote, "The greatest delight which the fields and woods may offer is a feeling of the infinite." This sentiment can inspire a new ethic of stewardship that goes beyond utilitarian calculations of ecosystem services. It calls for an effective bond, a sense of belonging to the natural world that can motivate collective action against climate change. By integrating Emerson's poetic sensibility with Morton's dark ecology, we can develop an environmental ethic that acknowledges both the awe and the anxiety of our planetary predicament, fostering policies that are both scientifically sound and spiritually resonant. Third, in the sphere of democratic renewal, Emerson's emphasis on the self-reliant individual can be harnessed to counteract the erosion of public discourse. In a media landscape dominated by algorithmic echo chambers, the call to listen to your own thoughts becomes a radical act of intellectual independence. Yet Emerson also reminds us that true independence is not isolation, it requires engagement with the great public. This dual imperative can inform contemporary movements for participatory democracy, encouraging citizens to cultivate personal critical thinking while also committing to dialogue and collective deliberation. The integration of Emerson's ideas with Nussbaum's capabilities framework suggests that a flourishing democracy must nurture both the inner capacities of its citizens and the external institutions that enable them to act. Finally, we must acknowledge that Emerson's philosophy, like any intellectual inheritance, is neither a panacea nor a relic. Its strengths lie in its capacity to inspire, its poetic imagination, and its insistence on moral agency. Its weaknesses emerge when the language is stripped of context, when it is wielded as a slogan devoid of critique, or when its lofty metaphysics are reduced to vague spirituality. By holding these tensions in view, we can honor Emerson not as an unassailable authority, but as a conversation partner who challenges us to think deeper, act more responsibly, and imagine new possibilities. In concluding this critical re-examination, let us return to Emerson's own words, spoken in the quiet of his cabin at Walden. What lies behind us and what lies ahead of us are tiny matters compared to what lives within us. May we take this invitation seriously, not as a call to retreat into a private sanctuary, but as a summons to bring the richness of that inner life into the public arena, into the design of our technologies, the stewardship of our planet, and the renewal of our democratic institutions. In doing so, we honor both the spirit of Emerson's transcendental vision and the demands of the complex world we now inhabit.